Welcome to the second video in the Spring and Loop Theory series. Here's the web address to read about the full theory. I'm going to try and introduce it to you today. In the first video I gave you an introduction of basically saying there's a lot of problems in physics. Sort of whichever theory you choose, there's a downside to it. Some of the new alternatives like string theory and some of their weaknesses. And I hinted at what's the basis of my theory, spring and loop theory, what's the basis of it, and that's where we're at. So, and I've sort of hinted that this Newton's cradle, this concept of these balls that ricochet like that, are at the core of spring and loop theory. So I'm going to put that over there. I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm using a video format so that I can try and illustrate using my hands, gesticulating, rather than just the voice or just the text. So this is the essence of spring and loop theory. Spring and loop theory says that there's something smaller than the subatomic. I mean, pretty much physics accepts that. And it's entirely reasonable. I don't think that's really a challengeable issue, not a big deal. So there's something smaller. What is it? I'm saying that if this is space, empty space as they call it, I'm saying that this space is full of springs. Now, they're not physical springs, but the metaphor, the concept of a spring is the closest thing that I can think of to describe what these things are that are out there. So let me elaborate a little bit. So I'm saying that in space, every unit of space, every inch of space is filled. And it's filled with energy, these springs representing energy. These are some sort of a bundle of energy. In other words, the energy doesn't just sort of mix and suddenly the whole space is the same. Like having ice cubes and then the ice cubes melt and suddenly you have all water. I'm saying it's not like that. For some reason, these bundles of energy maintain their own integrity. Much like a proton does, much like a planet does, much like a galaxy does. There's some element of integrity to those things. And I'm saying at the core layer, there's some integrity. There's some structure, in quotes. It's not a physical structure, but some structure that is maintained over long periods of time. I call that the universal matrix. Universal to the universe. A matrix, the concept of a matrix is, like a honeycomb matrix. You have the little honeycomb cells that every single inch of that honeycomb, of that what do they call them? The supers, the hives, they have those, I'm not sure what the individual units are called. Anyway, those individual boards with the wax starter on them, they're laid out in a honeycomb arrangement, and that honeycomb arrangement fills the board perfectly. It's one of these mathematically sort of beautiful shapes, the hexagonal shape, that you can fill a space with hexagons and completely occupy it. So that's where the word matrix comes from, and universal is as I say, obvious. So I'm saying there's a universal matrix. It's a matrix of bundles of energy, or if you want to think of them as springs. And unlike springs, these bundles of energy are self-powered. This is, again, a concept that I cannot easily give an analogy or an explanation where you go, oh yeah, that's why they're like that. Because this is one of the, I think, the more interesting things about life, about the universe, is that at its lowest level are its highest energies. Now, in our world, bigger is better, right? Follow the money. The person with more money we respect that person more. We listen to them more. We think they're better. The person is stronger. We think they're better. The person that runs faster. Everything, the bigger it is, the better it is, we think. And yet the weird thing is, the more you delve into particle physics, getting back to when you try and contain that electron, and when you try and contain it, it gets more energetic. Finally, to the point of breaking out of that smaller box. This is not intuitive. But again, it seems to be sort of a core property of the way life works. So, universal matrix of springs. Each of these springs are a self-contained energy source. So, given that sort of premise, that sort of what the premise, let's elaborate on it just a little bit so that we understand what I'm referring to. What are these springs? What are these quanta? What are these chunks of energy that space, that light, everything is filled with? I'm saying that they're basically a pulsing, vibrating, spring-like source of ultra-intense energy. This is something that is a little hard to convey. In string theory, this is, borrowing from string theory, where string theory says that strings are very high energy. The amount of energy is like on the order of like a million billion times the energy of a proton. So a string, even though it's like a million billion times smaller, it has a million billion times more energy. Unintuitive, it's the way it is. That's it. At a very, very tiny level. So, we have these things, and these things, basically just think of them like a spring, just each of these little pockets of space, each of these little honeycomb matrix entries, each of these little springs is doing this. It's just pounding away in the most intense way you can imagine, and then make it a billion times bigger. Maybe think of them like little nuclear bombs, only where a nuclear bomb goes out and doesn't come back in. These are going out and in constantly. So it's high energy, constant, and in pockets. This, I'm saying, is the core structure of the universe. The universal matrix is these springs. Energized, oscillating, pulsating, vibrating springs. Now, it's somewhat new maybe. It's sort of based on string theory and kind of has some convenient things. For example, that universal matrix explains what is dark energy. I'm saying that dark energy, as we're measuring it, is this spring energy, this background energy. And by the way, this is one of these conundrums of physics, the background energy of life should be very high. It should be 120 orders of magnitude higher than what they're measuring. And they can't detect this 120 orders of magnitude. They only detect this, cold background. Well, what I'm saying is that this background energy, this springs oscillating energy, this matrix, is so small, is at such a small granularity, is so tiny, each of these individual pockets, that it would be like an elephant trying to count grains of sand. How would an elephant count grains of sand? He could count rocks, he could count boulders of rocks, but when you get him down to the level of sand, he can't count it. Therefore, he can't see it. Therefore, you start talking to him about sand, and hey, Mr. Elephant, we'll pay you with sand. He's like, I don't think so, because it's too small. So, all right, so that's our basis. Empty space is filled with springs. It's filled with chunks, quanta of energy at the smallest scale. And this energy is bouncing against each other, but everyone pushes equally. Think of it like an army, a very large, very tiny army that is constantly ready to fight, let's say. Now, we don't have mass yet. We don't have things yet. We just have this energy. The mass, in my theory, are the loops. Generally accepted now that gravitons are loops. Again, where does it come from? I think the way I would explain it is this, using a chemistry model. In chemistry, you have solids, liquids, and gases, and they represent increases of energy. Solids have less energy, and then you heat it up and you get a liquid, and then you get a gas. But it also represents the affinity of something that it has for itself. For example, if you have lead, it's a solid. If you have mercury, it's a liquid. Now, they're both metals. They both have a lot of the properties of metals. But this metal, when it's with itself, it's very comfortable and stable and cold or low energy. This metal, mercury, when it's with itself, it's a little bit more willing to go somewhere else. It's a little bit less tied up. And then you have maybe a third element, whatever you want to choose. You could choose one of the noble ones, for example, and they're always gases, even when you try and cool them down very cold. Helium, you've got to cool it down to something like 4 degrees Kelvin, 269 degrees below 0 Celsius, super cold, before helium will become a liquid, and then something like a fraction of a degree or 1 degree or something before helium will become a solid. So the point I'm making is that it's the same basic stuff. You can't just easily point to say, well, lead is obviously different than mercury is different than helium or neon or xenon or argon or krypton. Really, at their core, each of them is a nucleus. Each of them has protons. Each of them has neutrons. Each of them has electrons flying around, or in some way electrons are in the picture. But you have 3 different things. Putting it another way, if you start with electrons, protons, and neutrons, a bunch of them, you can end up with solids, you can end up with liquids, and you can end up with gases. So, light is basically energy, vibration if you will, but energy we'll say. So we have a universal matrix of energy. Think of that as the gas in my analogy. And then think of the loops being the liquid. Something that's a little lower in energy, a little more stable, a little bit more comfortable with itself. And in the energy scale, if gases are the hottest and liquids are more medium temperatures, solids tend to be colder. So the universal matrix is high energy. Mass is more medium energy or cooler energy. And then there's maybe something else that's even a lower energy. So let's go with that. What I'm trying to do here is, by using a comparison with chemistry, between chemistry and physics, just to show you that in a given system of a pot of stuff, you can come out with different things from it. You can come out with solids, liquids, and gases, and you can come out of it with chunks of energy and loops. Yes, these are energy loops. Everything is energy. Mass and energy are interchangeable thanks to Einstein. But it's physically, or it has the properties of a loop, and as such it now behaves differently than a gas, or than a ball of energy, an amorphous, undefined ball of energy. So what do we get? We have these springs, these energetic springs, and we're going to introduce the smallest unit of gravity, of mass, into the system. I shouldn't say the smallest unit of gravity. It'll create the least gravity, but it's the smallest unit of mass, a single loop. We're going to introduce a single loop into this system. And what happens? Now for the metaphor, I'm going to use, this is my, where I need to have a video more than anything. Let me just get a pen here. You can see how prepared I am. So we have a spring world, and I can't easily represent those, but I can represent the loop. And we have these springs. Maybe I'll just represent them creatively with the letter S. And these S's want to go in and out. They are moving in and out, or vibrating in every direction. I don't know if they're very direction limited. There's not really any reason for them to be. So these S's, these springs, can move in all directions, and we introduce a loop into the picture. And by the way, this is a matrix of springs, so we're saying this whole page is filled with these springs, and we've introduced one loop now. What happens? This spring, when it wants to move this way, it hits something that's not like it, not like the others, right? When this spring hits this spring, they bounce off each other, basically. They bang back and forth and nothing happens. Here, the spring loop interaction, I'm saying that this spring can interact with this loop. It can do a number of things. But primarily it can get tangled or wrap around this loop. The analogy that I use is people dancing. They're on a dance floor, and you have, let's say it's a very energetic dance or music, like rock music or something like that, or just something extremely high energy and independent. In other words, each person is dancing independently. Maybe think of it like Woodstock. Mr. Richie Havens passed away yesterday. Let's dedicate this story to him, or this analogy to him. Let's say we're at Woodstock and we're listening to Richie Havens playing Freedom, and you have individuals dancing in the crowd, okay? And they're just throwing their arms around, they're dancing randomly. And you introduce a loop, and now a loop, we're saying, we're changing the performer. Richie Havens is finished, and now the next performer is playing a slow song. In this slow song, suddenly people, maybe it's a love song, more romantic, and people want to dance together with each other. And so now, instead of individuals sort of just doing their own thing, now we have an individual, another individual, and they join, right? They put their arms around each other, right? And this being Woodstock, maybe they do join in some way other than just putting their arms around each other. But we'll just say one of them's a loop, you know, the male and the female. Isn't it interesting that the male and the female symbols, there's the female and there's the male. Isn't it interesting that one is sort of, maybe can be thought of as like a spring, and the other is more a loop, right? Anyway, imagine in our story we have a person here and a person there, and they join together now. Instead of pulsating around, they're like this. My question to you is, what happens now on the dance floor, the Woodstock dance floor, what happens when people start doing this? These people start taking up less space than the people that are dancing wildly and freely. People that are dancing wildly and freely, yes, they're moving around more, and they can throw their arms out, and they're taking up a lot of space. The people that are dancing cheek to cheek or holding each other, you know, like a waltz or whatever, or just a slow dance, they're not taking up as much space. And in fact, what you can say is, around these people, space is contracted. They have made room within their space for something additional. You could fit something else near these people and it wouldn't break. You can put a little china cup next to them, a little small table, and put a teapot on there and a couple of teacups, and it would fit there and they wouldn't break it. The person thrashing their arms around would break it. Well, what are we saying in all that? What I'm saying is, that's how gravity works. Gravity is a contraction of space. When you introduce a loop, it pulls this S towards the O. It pulls this spring towards the O because part of the spring wraps around the O. If you think of a spring is a piece of metal that is, because of its energy, gets coiled. If you wrap that spring around something, then it shortens itself. If you stretch it out, it's long. If it's wrapped around something, it can be quite short. The spring loop interaction is a shortening. Things get closer together or shorter. So, on the dance floor, if everyone starts dancing like this spring and this loop are, they get closer together and you gain space or you contract space. Both of those being equivalent, strangely enough. So, how does gravity propagate? Well, let's redraw this. Now let's see something interesting. I'll do a dot, 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 spring, 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 dot, dot, dot. Here's our loop. There's another spring, 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 dot, dot, dot. This is a highly simplified diagram. Save our springs. And what it's basically saying is, where we had a uniform universal matrix of springs, when we've introduced this loop here, we have things near it are being pulled towards it. They are being attracted to it, maybe like tape of some kind or something sticky, or the stickiness of romance, of love, right, brings people together. Gravity is like love, right? It's attractive. One of the few, love and gravity are the only attractive forces I know of. Oh, actually, that's not true. Magnetism, or positive and negative charge, electromagnetism. But as we'll see, I think that's related. Okay, so what we have here is something familiar. This is curved space. Space being the springs, and now we have curved space in the presence of mass. What I'm saying is, when you introduce loops into a spring system, you get a contraction of space, not a warping or stretching. You get a contraction of space. In fact, when you say gravity stretches space, it's guaranteed wrong. It's always contracted. It's always a shrinking. And this is what makes gravity attract. It's always puzzled me, the attractive force. How could you conceive of it? And so, what does this say? There's some profound implications of Spring-And-Loop theory right away. Number one, there is an ether. The ether is the springs. Number two, we know what dark energy is. It's the springs. Number three, we know how gravity works. Number four, we see that gravity is contracted. It's not this warping business. And so right away, those words have to be changed. Another thing we see is the bowling ball metaphor. We say that, if this is space and if you have the sun in the middle, it pushes down, and so that's what causes the Earth to rotate around, is that you have this bowling ball pushing down on a flexible membrane, and it causes other balls to rotate around it. Now we realize that that's wrong. I mean, we already know it's wrong, but now we realize that conceptually we can do one better. And so maybe we can call this the dance floor model, where on the dance floor, when you dance a slow dance, that's gravity. That's love, right? I mean, they are exactly similar behavior, right? Okay, so that's the essence of Spring-And-Loop theory. And as I say, there are a lot of repercussions that just spill out of this theory. So this theory is kind of a boom, here's this big new change, and then, these are all the realizations that come with it.